March 23, 1945, 2100 hours. On the western embankment of the Aethel River near Corvus, Germany, the binoculars in Oberleutnant Klaus Richter's hands quivered almost imperceptibly as his gaze swept across the darkening waters, his hand scribbling observations in a field notebook, a journal destined to be discovered among captured German documents at Army Group headquarters. They had come, the Americans, to the edge of our sacred river. But they would not cross. They could not cross, for no army in history had ever breached the Aethel against the unyielding wall of German resistance without the aid of bridges. Through the deepening twilight, he had just witnessed a sight that solidified 3 years of Wehrmacht defensive doctrine. Far across the water, artillery flashes painted the western bank, the thunder of 1,000 guns heralding what German commanders were certain would be a conventional river assault, a predictable drama requiring days of painstaking preparation, fixed bridging operations, and vulnerable crossing points their formidable 88mm guns could methodically annihilate. Here, in the heartland of Germany, the Aethel had stood as the nation's guardian for 2 millennia. Even in this moment, with the Reich collapsing from both east and west, military engineers confidently assured their commanders that the river's immense 300-foot breadth and its powerful, swirling currents rendered it utterly impassable without prolonged and complex engineering efforts. At that very moment, 2,000 men from the 51st Highland Division's 7th Battalion, the Black Watch, were making ready to enter that same water. They were not boarding vulnerable assault boats that would need to shuttle back and forth under a hail of fire, nor were they waiting for engineers to complete pontoon bridges under a relentless artillery bombardment. But instead, they were climbing aboard vehicles that German intelligence had catastrophically, fatally failed to properly evaluate. The peculiar boat-shaped trucks, designated DUKW, had been spotted before in Normandy and in Italy, but Wehrmacht analysts had casually dismissed them as nothing more than specialized landing craft, curiosities for beach operations with no relevance to the stark realities of river warfare. The very mathematics of the Aethel defense were about to be violently shattered, not by a superiority in firepower, not by overwhelming numbers, but by a flash of American industrial ingenuity that German defenders could never have conceived would be brought to bear against their final natural fortress. It was a systematic, cascading failure of intelligence, a failure that would in a matter of hours transform Germany's uncrossable moat into a veritable highway for Allied armor. The collapse had truly begun months before, rooted in the flawed soil of German intelligence assessments. General Armand Falkenrath, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would later confess to Allied interrogators the Wehrmacht's profound and fundamental misreading of American amphibious capabilities. Intelligence dispatches from Sicily, from Salerno, and from Normandy had described these Schwimmwagen, these swimming trucks, yet German analysts had merely filed the reports away among the oddities of American industrial excess. Like the fabled ice cream ships and the Coca-Cola battalions, among the river's defenders was Major Erich von Meyer, the son of Field Marshal Walter Model, serving with the 1st Parachute Army. His personal diary, captured following his surrender in April 1945, would grant historians a startlingly clear window into the bedrock of German assumptions regarding the Aethel's defense. The Wehrmacht's most seasoned officers, men who had meticulously studied river crossings from the Dnieper to the Seine, were convinced they understood the immutable, unchangeable laws of amphibious assault. Attackers, they knew, required overwhelming artillery superiority, specialized bridging equipment, and, most critically of all, they needed time. Time to establish the very crossing points that defenders could then mercilessly target. But the first true glimpse of German ignorance was unearthed in their own assessment documents, discovered at captured command posts. Hauptmann Konrad Adler, an intelligence officer with the 15th Army, had assembled reports on Allied equipment that mentioned the DUKW precisely 3 times over a 6-month period of exhaustive documentation. Each reference casually waved them away as coastal operations equipment, possessing no tactical relevance to inland river warfare. The reports went on to estimate that American forces likely possessed a mere 50 to 100 of these vehicles in the entire European theater. The reality was a force of nature. By March of 1945, more than 2,000 DUKWs were operating in the European theater alone. The U.S. Army had skillfully organized them into specialized amphibious truck companies, each fielding 50 vehicles and their highly trained crews. These unique units had been relentlessly practicing river-crossing operations since the days of Normandy, forging a new doctrine that German intelligence had never even detected. The British, in turn, had received 2,000 DUKWs through the Lend-Lease program, adding their own distinctive operational innovations. Canadian forces commanded 800 units, each with specialized modifications for cold weather performance. The DUKW's very development was a masterclass in American problem-solving at its most ruthlessly efficient. In April of 1942, when a Coast Guard patrol boat became grounded on a sandbar near Provincetown, Massachusetts, conventional trucks proved incapable of reaching it through the treacherous surf and sand. This seemingly minor incident ignited a revolution in amphibious warfare, a revolution that would ultimately help to extinguish the Third Reich. Palmer Cresswell, working for the Office of Scientific Research and Development, joined forces with yacht designer Roderick Sloan Jr. and engineer Dennis Pullman to dream into existence a truck that could move with seamless grace from water to land. When the Ford Motor Company declined the project, declaring it an impossible feat within the required time frame, the General Motors Corporation boldly accepted the challenge on April 23, 1942. The engineering team at GMC's Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company in Pontiac, Michigan, worked with a feverish intensity around the clock. By June 2, 1942, a mere 38 days later, the first prototype rolled out of the factory. The vehicle ingeniously married a standard GMC CCKW2 1-2-ton truck chassis with a watertight hull designed by the naval architects at Sparkman and Stevens. Its designation, DUKW, was born from GMC's own internal nomenclature system. D for the 1942 design year, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. The secret to the DUKW's astonishing versatility was hidden within several key innovations. Frank Spicer, a brilliant mind on GMC's engineering team, developed the Central Tire Inflation System, or CTIS, the very first of its kind in the world, which allowed drivers to adjust tire pressure on the move. At a soft 10 to 12 pounds per square inch, the tires would spread wide, gripping sand and mud with ease. At a firm 40 to 45 psi, they delivered remarkable efficiency on paved highways. A 25-inch propeller, driven through a transfer case from the main transmission, provided powerful water propulsion at 5.5 knots, while a rudder, cleverly linked to the steering wheel, permitted a fluid, uninterrupted transition from navigating on water to driving on land. Major General Jacob Devers witnessed the very first demonstration in June 1942 and, without a moment's hesitation, ordered the vehicle into mass production. The initial contract demanded 2,000 units. By the war's end, GMC had manufactured an astounding 21,147 DUKWs, churning them out at an unprecedented pace of 525 per month during peak production, each one costing just $10,050. This was roughly the price of 7 Jeeps, but with capabilities that would soon prove to be utterly priceless. March 1945 discovered Germany's Aethel defenses in a condition of decay that Wehrmacht commanders refused to admit, even to themselves. General Kurt Vogel's 1st Parachute Army, the most potent German force left in the West, had been bled white in the brutal battles of the Blackwood Forest, losing 90,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. The reinforcements now arriving to defend the Aethel were Volkssturm units, cobbled together from old men and young boys with only a few weeks of training, armed with a motley collection of captured weapons and wearing simple armbands instead of proper uniforms. Feldwebel Anton Schmidt of the 181st Infantry Division, positioned near Corvus, wrote in a letter to his wife dated March 20th, "The Americans are across from us now, thousands upon thousands of them. We can hear their vehicles moving day and night, but the Aethel protects us. Even the great Napoleon could not cross the Aethel against opposition. The engineers have destroyed every single bridge, and our artillery has every conceivable crossing point precisely registered. The defensive preparations, on paper, appeared truly formidable. Since September 1944, over 200,000 civilian laborers had been conscripted to reinforce the West Wall fortifications and extend them towards the Aethel. 3,000 concrete bunkers and gun positions had been newly constructed or heavily reinforced. The river itself provided what German doctrine called the perfect water obstacle, far too wide for assault bridges, its current too swift for small boats, its depths too profound for fording. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had taken command in the West following von Rundstedt's dismissal, issued orders that laid bare the totality of German assumptions. The enemy will require 48 to 72 hours to establish viable bridgeheads after their initial crossings. This window, he declared, provides the opportunity for counterattack with our mobile reserves. These so-called mobile reserves consisted of the 47th Panzer Corps, with approximately 150 operational armored vehicles, tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers combined, to cover a sprawling front of nearly 200 miles. But the most critical German failure was conceptual, a failure of imagination. Wehrmacht doctrine, refined and hardened through 5 long years of war, understood river crossings as sequential, predictable operations. First, you suppress the defenders with artillery. Second, you send infantry across in vulnerable assault boats. Third, you establish small, tenuous bridgeheads. Fourth, you begin the dangerous work of bridge construction under constant fire. Fifth, you reinforce gradually as the bridges are completed. And then finally, only then, do you send your armor across. Each distinct phase presented defenders with golden opportunities to concentrate their fire and to launch devastating counterattacks. Unknown to German intelligence, the Allied forces had stealthily assembled the largest concentration of amphibious vehicles in history along the Aethel's western bank. By March 22, 1945, hundreds of DUKWs had been positioned in carefully concealed areas, all within 5 miles of their planned crossing points. Each vehicle had been meticulously waterproofed, mechanically inspected, and loaded with specific cargo manifests designed to maintain their delicate stability in the water. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Cole, commanding the 458th Amphibious Truck Company, recalled the painstaking preparation. We knew this wasn't Normandy with its tides and beach obstacles. The Aethel was all about the current, about finding the right exit points, about coordinating with artillery so we didn't get hit by our own shells. We practiced on the Meuse River for 2 solid weeks, learning exactly how the DUKWs handled in a fast current. The vehicles themselves had been modified and improved based on 3 years of hard-won combat experience. Armor plating now protected the drivers and vital mechanical components. Ring mounts for 50-caliber machine guns provided a potent self-defense capability. Most critically, specialized bilge pumps had been installed that could handle the water intake from small arms fire, allowing the DUKWs to continue their mission even when their hulls were perforated by enemy bullets. Captain Leo Donovan of the 819th Amphibious Truck Company vividly described the final briefing. They told us we were going to do something nobody had ever done before. We were going to use DUKWs as the primary assault vehicle for a major river crossing. Not as support vessels, not as supply carriers after the bridges were built, but as the actual spearhead. Each duck would carry a full rifle squad with all their equipment, cross the Aethel, drive right up the eastern bank, and deposit those troops directly into combat positions. The British forces had brought their own amphibious assets to the fight. The 79th Armored Division, under the command of Major General Percy Hobart, had deployed 600 LVT-4 Buffalo amphibious tractors, each capable of carrying 30 men. These would work in concert with the American DUKWs in what was about to become the largest amphibious river crossing in the annals of military history. But it was the DUKWs, with their unique ability to transition seamlessly from water to land operations, that would prove most devastating to every German assumption. At 1700 hours on March 23, 1945, the greatest artillery bombardment of the Aethel campaign commenced. Over 4,000 Allied guns, from 25-pounders to massive 240mm howitzers, unleashed a 4-hour barrage that seemed to transform the very air into a solid, screaming wall of steel and high explosive. German observers reported that the eastern bank appeared to be boiling under the relentless impact of thousands of shells per minute. Gefreiter Stefan Bauer, manning an observation post near Corvus, attempted to count the muzzle flashes across the river. I stopped counting at 500. It was like looking at a solid line of flame, stretching north and south as far as my eyes could see. The noise was beyond description. Not individual explosions, but one continuous, soul-shaking roar that made thought itself impossible. Under the protective cloak of this bombardment and the deepening darkness, the first DUKWs slipped into the Aethel at precisely 2100 hours. The 51st Highland Division led the assault, with the 7th Battalion Black Watch loaded into DUKWs operated by highly skilled American crews. Each vehicle carried 12 fully equipped soldiers in addition to its 2-man crew. Navigation lights, carefully shielded to be visible only from behind, marked the entry and exit points on both banks. Sergeant Ian MacLeod of the Black Watch described the crossing with a soldier's simple clarity. We rolled down the bank and then suddenly we were floating. The American driver just kept on driving like we were still on land, except now the water was rushing past us. The engine noise was terrific, and we could hear German shells hitting the water all around us. But we couldn't see a thing in the darkness and the smoke. The current proved to be even stronger than anticipated, reaching 8 to 10 knots in the main channel. The DUKWs were launched upstream of their intended landing points, their drivers calculating the drift like navigators plotting aircraft courses in a fierce crosswind. Some vehicles were swept hundreds of yards downstream, but their incredible ability to simply drive up any reasonably sloped bank meant they could exit the river wherever they happened to find themselves. By 2200 hours, the first wave was across. German defenders, straining their ears, expecting to hear the sound of assault boats returning for the second wave, instead heard only the continued, deafening roar of the Allied artillery. The DUKWs had driven straight up the eastern banks and had vanished into the darkness, their passengers already engaging German positions from completely unexpected directions. As dawn broke on March 24th, German commanders began receiving a flood of reports that defied all logic and explanation. Enemy troops were appearing miles inland from the crossing points, in battalion strength, already equipped with heavy weapons and supplies. The expected predictable pattern of gradually expanding bridgeheads simply hadn't materialized. Instead, Allied forces seemed to be everywhere at once. Hauptmann Gregor Reichhardt, commanding a battery of 88mm guns positioned to cover the crossing site at Rhine, reported frantically to divisional headquarters, "Enemy armor is behind us. I repeat, enemy armor is behind our position. How did they get across? All the bridges are destroyed. We have seen no pontoon construction." What Reichardt's men had encountered weren't tanks, but DUKWs carrying infantry support weapons, mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank guns that had driven directly from the Aethel to positions 3 miles inland. The vehicle's unique amphibious capability allowed them to simply bypass the German strong points that had been positioned to defend the obvious routes leading from the riverbank. The true scale of the operation became terrifyingly apparent as the morning fog began to lift. Hundreds of DUKWs were shuttling across the Aethel in continuous unbroken streams. Unlike assault boats, which required engineer crews and were limited to perpendicular crossings at prepared sites, the DUKWs could enter and exit the river anywhere the banks permitted. German artillery observers reported with growing panic that swimming trucks were crossing at dozens of points along a 22-mile front. Major Klaus Steiner, operations officer for the 185th Division, recorded in his war diary, "The enemy has deployed a type of amphibious vehicle in numbers we never, ever anticipated. Our entire defensive plan assumed 6 to 8 crossing points that we could target with concentrated fire. Instead, they are crossing everywhere. Our guns cannot possibly engage so many targets simultaneously." The British Second Army's crossing at Corvus employed a devastating combination of DUKWs and Buffalo LVTs, the 15th Scottish Division crossed in the Buffaloes, while the DUKWs followed immediately, bringing their heavy weapons and vital supplies. By 0800 hours, despite ferocious resistance from the 1st Parachute Army, 3 full divisions were across the Aethel with their complete equipment loads. At 10 hours on March 24th, the thunder of aircraft engines added a new layer to the battle's cacophony. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history, commenced as a massive air armada appeared over the Aethel. The operation involved more than 1,700 transport aircraft and over 1,350 gliders, carrying 16,000 paratroopers and glider-borne troops. This was not the isolated paratroop drop that German doctrine had expected, but a coordinated hammer blow, designed to work in perfect synchrony with the amphibious assault. Obergefreiter Franz Weber of the 84th Infantry Division watched in awe from his position near Brinkum. The sky turned black with aircraft. Parachutes bloomed like strange flowers, thousands upon thousands of them. We thought this had to be the main assault, that the river crossings were just diversions. Then we learned the Americans were already 10 kilometers behind us with their swimming trucks. The airborne forces, the U.S. 17th Airborne and the British 6th Airborne Divisions, landed within artillery range of the Aethel crossings, a tactical gambit that German commanders had never anticipated. Previous airborne operations had dropped paratroopers far behind enemy lines to operate independently. This time, they landed just 6 miles from the river, directly supporting the amphibious forces. The coordination between the airborne and amphibious forces multiplied their effectiveness exponentially. DUKWs carrying ammunition and medical supplies drove directly to airborne positions that, in previous operations, would have required risky air supply drops or a long wait to link up with ground forces. Days later, wounded paratroopers were evacuated in DUKWs, returning to the western bank, something that would have been impossible in traditional airborne operations. Private First Class Jack Riley of the 17th Airborne later wrote, "We were fighting for this crossroads when these weird-looking truck boats came driving up. No splashing, no bogging down. They just drove out of the woods like regular trucks, except we knew they'd just crossed the Aethel." The crew chief yelled, "Anybody need ammo? We thought we were hallucinating." By noon on March 24th, the full, earth-shattering implications of the DUKW assault became crystal clear to the German commanders. This wasn't just a new way to cross rivers. It was a complete and total revolution in amphibious logistics, one that invalidated every single assumption in their defensive planning. Traditional river crossings required sequential phases: the assault crossing, bridgehead consolidation, bridge construction, and finally, supply buildup. Each phase was a point of vulnerability, a target for counterattack. Bridges once built became critical choke points that concentrated targets for artillery and air attack. The DUKWs eliminated these vulnerabilities entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Grant Saxon, logistics officer for the 16th Corps, had established what he called DUKW highways across the Aethel. Vehicles loaded on the western bank with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel simply drove into the river, crossed, and delivered their cargo directly to the combat units. There was no unloading at the riverbank, no transfer to different vehicles, no waiting for bridges. "We were running 50 DUKWs per hour at our crossing point," Saxon reported. Each one carried 2.5 tons of supplies, or 25 men. That's 125 tons of supplies, or 250 troops every hour, around the clock. The Germans kept looking for bridges to bomb, but there weren't any, just trucks driving through water. The psychological impact on the German defenders was devastating. Feldwebel Marcus Grotz of the 2nd Parachute Regiment wrote in his diary, "They have unlimited vehicles that swim. How do you stop an army that can turn any river into a road? We blow up bridges for nothing. They don't need bridges." Supply sergeants reported surreal, almost unbelievable experiences. Technical Sergeant Frank Moretti of the 30th Infantry Division described establishing a supply dump. "We're 3 miles from the Aethel on the German side, right? And here comes a DUKW straight from the water, dripping wet, carrying hot food in insulated containers. The cooks on the western bank had prepared the meal, loaded it in the duck, and it drove straight to us. Hot coffee in the middle of a battle. The Germans must have thought we were insane. March 25th dawned with German commanders facing a situation that Wehrmacht doctrine had never even addressed. The Aethel, Germany's historic barrier, had become irrelevant. Not conquered, not breached, but simply bypassed by an expression of American industrial ingenuity that German intelligence had dismissed as a mere curiosity. General Kurt Vogel, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, held a command conference that morning in a farmhouse near the Brixton farmstead. The surviving record of this meeting, compiled from the testimonies of captured officers, reveals the profound depth of German dismay. Vogel reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we prepared to fight the last war. We assumed the enemy would attack our fortress. Instead, they drove around it." The numbers were staggering. In the first 48 hours, DUKWs had transported over 15,000 troops across the Aethel. More critically, they had moved 1,200 vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and light armor that traditional crossing methods wouldn't have been able to deliver for days. Artillery pieces were being ferried across and were firing from the eastern bank before German intelligence had even confirmed the crossings had occurred. Oberst Heinrich von Leutwitz, commanding the remnants of Panzer Brigade 106, attempted a counterattack near Velden on March 25th. His unit's war diary records the futility of the effort. Attacked toward river to destroy enemy bridgehead. Found no bridgehead in the traditional sense. Enemy forces distributed across a 15-kilometer front with no apparent center. Swimming vehicles continuously reinforcing all points. Impossible to identify a critical target. Attack failed with heavy losses. The British were achieving similar stunning success. The Scottish divisions had pushed 6 miles inland by the end of March 25th, supported by continuous DUKW supply runs. Royal Artillery forward observers were calling in fire missions while riding in DUKWs, using the vehicle's unique mobility to evade German counter-battery fire. The Aethel crossing starkly exposed the industrial asymmetry between American mass production and the German philosophy of craftsmanship. While German engineers had developed their own amphibious vehicle, the Landwasser Schlepper, or LWS, the production comparison revealed everything about why Germany was losing the war. The LWS was, in many ways, superior to the DUKW. It could carry 20 men compared to the DUKW's 25, but it had better armor protection. Its track design provided superior performance in mud and snow. German engineers had solved complex problems of waterproofing track systems and creating reliable bilge pumps. As a piece of engineering, it was remarkable. But Germany had produced only about 100 units in total, with even fewer seeing operational service. The LWS required specialized components, skilled craftsmen for its assembly, and rare materials for its armor and waterproofing. Each unit cost approximately 75,000 Reichsmarks, 7 times the cost of a DUKW. Meanwhile, General Motors had produced 21,147 DUKWs using existing truck components and assembly line methods. The vehicle shared its engine, transmission, axles, and countless other parts with the standard CCKW truck, of which an incredible 562-750 were built. This standardization meant that any mechanic familiar with military trucks could maintain a DUKW. Spare parts were abundant. Damaged vehicles were quickly repaired or cannibalized. Master Sergeant Ray Corbin, maintenance chief for the 462nd Amphibious Truck Company, explained the advantage. We kept 90% of our ducts operational throughout the crossing. When something broke, we had the parts. When we didn't have the parts, we could adapt something from a regular truck. Try doing that with some specialized German wonder weapon. The production philosophy extended far beyond mere numbers. American DUKWs were designed for ease of operation. Any soldier who could drive a truck could learn to operate a DUKW in a few hours. German vehicles required extensively trained, specialized crews. American mass production assumed its operators would be citizen soldiers with minimal training. German design assumed its operators would be professional soldiers with months of preparation. Personal accounts from both sides of the Aethel reveal the human dimension of this technological and tactical revolution. These were not abstract production statistics or dry strategic assessments, but young men experiencing the very transformation of warfare in real time. Private First Class Sam Hughes of the 89th Infantry Division recalled his first sight of the DUKWs. "We were lined up on the West Bank, expecting to crowd into assault boats under fire, just like we'd trained. Then these things that looked like boats with wheels came rolling down the bank. A Navy guy, Navy, in the middle of Germany, waves us aboard. I asked him, 'What the hell is this thing?' He grinned and said, 'Your taxi to Berlin, soldier.'" The presence of U.S. Navy personnel operating DUKWs deep in continental Europe only added to the German confusion. Seaman Second Class Evan Mallory, assigned to a naval detachment operating DUKWs for the Aethel crossing, described the German reaction. "We captured some Germans who just stared at our Navy uniforms. One who spoke English kept asking, 'How is the American Navy here? The ocean is 300 miles away.' He simply couldn't process what he was seeing." German accounts reveal a progressive, deepening demoralization as the scope of American amphibious capability became devastatingly clear. Lieutenant Gunther Schulze of the 338th Infantry Division wrote in a letter captured after his unit's surrender, "They came across the river like it was a street. Not sneaking, not rushing between artillery barrages, but driving. Trucks full of soldiers driving through the Aethel. We shot at them, but more kept coming. Always more. Where did they get so many?" Unteroffizier Peter Braun, captured on March 26, told his interrogators, "We were told the Aethel would stop you for weeks, that you would have to build bridges we would destroy, that your assault boats would be easy targets for our guns. Nobody told us about swimming trucks. Nobody warned us you could cross anywhere at any time. We prepared for the wrong war." By March 26, 1945, just 72 hours after the first DUKW entered the Aethel, the German defensive position had completely and utterly collapsed. What Wehrmacht doctrine had insisted would take weeks had been accomplished in 3 days. The Aethel barrier, which propaganda had claimed would hold until negotiations could salvage something of the Reich, had simply evaporated. The statistics from those 3 remarkable days revealed the scope of the revolution. DUKWs had completed over 5,000 individual crossings. They had transported 15,000 troops, 1,200 vehicles, 3,000 tons of supplies, and evacuated 2,000 wounded. Traditional bridging operations, had they been required, would have needed 2 weeks to achieve a similar throughput, all while under constant, relentless attack. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, often criticized for his excessive caution, had achieved complete operational surprise through the mass employment of amphibious vehicles. His after-action report noted, "The enemy expected us to cross the Aethel. They did not expect us to drive across it. The distinction proved fatal to their defense." General Dwight Eisenhower visited the crossing sites on March 26. His reaction, recorded by his aide Captain Harry Butcher, was telling. Ike watched, the DUKWs streaming back and forth like a ceaseless ferry service. He turned to General Bradley and said, "With these things, every river in Germany is now a highway." Bradley replied, "The Germans are just figuring that out." The psychological collapse was absolute. Joseph Goebbels' diary entry for March 26 read, "The situation in the West has become impossible. The enemy has crossed the Aethel along a broad front with a new type of amphibious vehicle we failed to anticipate. Our last natural barrier is gone. The war is lost." March 27 saw the full exploitation of the Aethel breakthrough. With German forces in complete disarray, Allied commanders unleashed their mobile forces. The DUKWs, having accomplished their amphibious mission, now revealed another astonishing capability. They could operate as regular trucks, advancing with the armored spearheads. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, had been fed across the river in record time. Tank crews described the surreal experience of following DUKWs that had just emerged from the Aethel. still dripping water as they raced down German autobahns. The amphibious vehicles carried fuel and ammunition directly to the advancing tank units, eliminating the traditional time-consuming pause for supply buildup after a river crossing. Major General Isaac D. White, commanding the 2nd Armored, reported, "We advanced 50 miles on March 27th alone. In any previous operation, we would have been waiting for bridges to be completed and supplies to be stockpiled. Instead, the DUKWs kept pace with us. They'd cross rivers we encountered, scout for crossing sites, and establish supply points before our main body even arrived." German resistance crumbled into isolated, desperate pockets. Units that had prepared to counterattack bridgeheads found themselves bypassed by Allied forces that seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. The rigid German defensive doctrine, based on identifying and destroying fixed crossing points, had no answer for hundreds of amphibious vehicles creating their own crossing points at will. Oberst Hans von Luck, one of Germany's most experienced armored commanders, encountered American forces near Haldon on March 28. His memoir describes the meeting with a sense of awe. "My battalion was racing to establish a blocking position when we encountered American troops already dug in. I asked a captured lieutenant how they had moved so quickly. He pointed to a line of those amphibious trucks and said, 'We don't wait for bridges.' It was then I truly understood that Germany had lost more than a battle. We had lost an entire form of warfare." The full impact of the DUKW on the Aethel crossing extends far beyond the impressive statistics of vehicles and supplies transported. The amphibious trucks had fundamentally altered the mathematics of river assault, creating advantages that compounded exponentially. Traditional river crossings concentrated forces at specific points, creating perfect targets for artillery and air attack. The DUKWs dispersed the crossings along the entire front, diluting German firepower to the point of ineffectiveness. Wehrmacht doctrine called for counterattacking bridgeheads before they could consolidate. But there were no traditional bridgeheads, just a continuous, unstoppable infiltration across a broad front. Colonel Marcus Cole, who commanded DUKW operations for the 9th Army, calculated the time savings. Building a heavy pontoon bridge under fire typically took 12 to 24 hours, minimum. During that time, you could only reinforce by assault boat, maybe a company per hour if things went well. We were moving a battalion per hour with DUKWs from the very first minute of the operation. The medical impact was profound but often overlooked. Captain Eleanor Dalton, a nurse with the 45th Field Hospital, described the revolutionary evacuation system. Wounded soldiers were loaded into DUKWs on the eastern bank and driven directly to our hospital on the western side. No transfer between vehicles, no waiting for bridges. We were getting casualties to surgery within an hour of being wounded. That simply wasn't possible in traditional river crossings. The DUKWs also enabled tactical innovations that were impossible with conventional crossing methods. Artillery forward observers could relocate rapidly in DUKWs, making German counter-battery fire almost useless. Engineers used DUKWs to transport bridge sections, actually accelerating traditional bridge construction, even as they made it less critical. Radio relay stations housed in DUKWs maintained flawless communications across the water barrier. Post-war analysis revealed the shocking depth of the German intelligence failure regarding American amphibious capabilities. The Wehrmacht had observed DUKWs in multiple operations: Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, yet they never grasped their strategic implications for river-crossing operations. General Major Reinhard Keller, Chief of Foreign Armies East and later the founder of West German intelligence, admitted in his memoirs, "We catalogued American equipment meticulously. We knew about the DUKW. We simply never imagined they would mass hundreds of them for a river crossing. Our thinking was constrained by our own limitations. Because we could only produce a handful of amphibious vehicles, we assumed the Americans faced similar constraints." Captured German intelligence files revealed a systematic, almost willful underestimation. A February 1945 assessment by Army Group H estimated that Allied forces possessed approximately 100 to 150 amphibious vehicles suitable for river operations. The actual number was over 2,000 in the 21st Army Group alone. Another report dismissed DUKWs as useful for supply operations after beaches are secured, but unsuitable for assault operations. The failure went beyond mere numbers. German intelligence never identified the specialized amphibious truck companies, never detected their training exercises on the Meuse River, never recognized the doctrinal revolution that was underway. They were preparing to fight the river crossing they expected, not the one that actually occurred. Major Joachim Engel, intelligence officer for the 1st Parachute Army, testified after his capture, "We studied every Allied river crossing from the Rapido to the Seine. We thought we understood their methods. The massed employment of amphibious vehicles simply wasn't in our calculations. It was as if they had developed the ability to fly tanks across the river, something completely outside our frame of reference." Surely. Despite the tactical and technological superiority demonstrated at the Aethel, the crossing was not bloodless. The human cost, while far lower than traditional assault methods would have demanded, remained significant. Allied casualties for Operations Plunder and Varsity totaled 6,181, 3,168 British and Commonwealth, 2,113 American. The airborne forces suffered heavily from anti-aircraft fire, with some aircraft shot down before the troops could even jump. The 17th Airborne Division lost 430 men killed in action in a single day. DUKWs evacuating the wounded came under German artillery fire, with several vehicles lost with all aboard. Private Eric Johansson, a combat engineer with the 89th Infantry Division, described his unit's crossing at the Argenton Bluffs on March 26. "We lost 250 men out of 420 trying to establish our sector. The DUKWs got us across fast, but the Germans were waiting on the high ground with machine guns and mortars. Speed doesn't make you bulletproof." German casualties were catastrophic. The 1st Parachute Army effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Over 16,000 prisoners were captured in the first 72 hours. Many simply abandoned their positions once they realized the Aethel barrier had failed. Entire units found themselves cut off as DUKW transported forces appeared behind them. Gefreiter Werner Kohl of the 84th Infantry Division was captured on March 25. His interrogation revealed the psychological impact with chilling clarity. "We held our positions for 2 days, firing at the crossing sites. Then Americans appeared behind us. When we asked the prisoners how they had crossed, they pointed at those swimming trucks. Our lieutenant threw down his weapon and said, 'If they can drive trucks across the Aethel, the war is over.' And nobody disagreed." One of the most remarkable episodes of the Aethel crossing occurred on March 25, when Prime Minister Winston Churchill insisted on personally crossing the Aethel. This was not mere theatrics. Churchill understood the profound historical significance of Allied armies crossing Germany's sacred river. Churchill, accompanied by Field Marshal Montgomery and General Alan Brooke, first observed the crossings from a demolished railway bridge at Corvus. Then, against the urgent advice of his security detail and Eisenhower's explicit orders, Churchill boarded an American LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, and crossed to the eastern bank. Montgomery's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Tristram Warren, recorded the scene. "The PM was absolutely determined. He said, 'I am going to cross the Aethel. I have waited years for this moment.' The American crew was horrified when they realized who their passenger was, but Churchill was already aboard, cigar clamped in his teeth, making V for victory signs. For 30 minutes, the British Prime Minister stood on German soil east of the Aethel, while German artillery shells landed close enough to spray the party with debris. Churchill reportedly picked up a handful of earth and said, 'German soil. At last.' The crossing was militarily unnecessary and reckless, but psychologically powerful beyond measure. the leader of Great Britain standing defiant on conquered German territory. The incident revealed yet another advantage of the amphibious assault. Churchill could cross because DUKWs and landing craft were continuously operating. With traditional bridging, such a crossing would have required shutting down all military traffic on a single critical bridge. The distributed, fluid nature of the amphibious operation made Churchill's theatrical gesture possible. The success of the Aethel crossing accelerated the end of the European war by an estimated 3 weeks, according to a post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. This acceleration came not from the mere fact of crossing, but from the incredible speed and breadth of the operation, enabled entirely by amphibious vehicles. Traditional river crossing doctrine would have required sequential operations. Establish small bridgeheads, build bridges under fire, reinforce gradually, then break out after a lengthy supply buildup. This process, even if successful, would have taken 2 to 3 weeks minimum. German forces would have had time to establish new defensive lines, destroy infrastructure, and potentially negotiate. Instead, the Allies achieved in 72 hours what German planning had assumed would take weeks. By March 26th, 3 Allied armies were racing into Germany's interior. The Saar industrial basin, Germany's industrial heart, was encircled. By April 1st, the sheer speed of the advance prevented the Germans from destroying factories, bridges, and supplies that might have prolonged resistance. General Omar Bradley calculated the lives saved. If we'd had to cross the Aethel the traditional way, assault boats, engineers building bridges under fire, gradual reinforcement, we'd have lost 50,000 men, minimum. The DUKWs turned what should have been a bloodbath into a transportation exercise. The strategic impact rippled eastward. Soviet forces, learning of the Aethel crossing's stunning success, accelerated their own operations toward Berlin, not wanting the Western Allies to capture the Nazi capital. The race between East and West that would shape post-war Europe was intensified by DUKWs crossing the Aethel. By March 28, 1945, the German command structure in the West had effectively disintegrated. Communications between units broke down as headquarters retreated or were overrun. The speed of the Allied advance, enabled by the Aethel crossing's success, prevented any coordinated defensive response. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, found his forces divided and trapped in the Saar pocket. His final order, issued on March 29th, revealed a profound despair. The enemy has achieved the impossible at the Aethel. Further resistance only increases suffering. I release all soldiers from their oath. Save yourselves as best you can. Model committed suicide on April 21st rather than surrender. The psychological collapse was complete. Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought tenaciously for every German village now surrendered in masses. The Aethel had held a mythic significance. Its loss meant the war was truly over. Units that might have conducted guerrilla warfare simply dissolved. Civilian morale, already shattered by bombing, completely collapsed. The Aethel crossing demonstrated that no natural barrier could protect Germany. If the Aethel could be crossed in 3 days, what was the point of continued resistance? Local officials began negotiating the surrender of their towns to avoid destruction. Hans Frank, the Nazi Governor-General of Poland, wrote in his diary, "The Aethel is crossed. The sacred river that protected Germany for 2,000 years has fallen in 72 hours. If there was any doubt about our fate, it is gone. We face not defeat, but annihilation." The Aethel crossing fundamentally changed military thinking about amphibious operations. Prior to March 1945, amphibious assault was primarily associated with seaborne invasions. Normandy, the Pacific Island hopping campaign. The Aethel demonstrated that amphibious capabilities were equally decisive in continental warfare. The U.S. Army's official history concluded, "The mass employment of DUKWs at the Aethel represents a revolution in military affairs equivalent to the introduction of armor in World War I. The ability to treat water obstacles as highways rather than as barriers fundamentally alters operational planning." Soviet observers attached to Allied headquarters took careful notes. Colonel Ivan Yevgrafov reported to Moscow, "The Americans have solved the problem of river crossing through industrial mass production. They simply built so many amphibious vehicles that rivers become irrelevant. This has profound implications for any future conflict in Europe. The British Army, despite having participated in the operation, conducted its own extensive studies. Brigadier Richard Wakefield wrote, "We must never again assume that water barriers provide a significant defensive advantage against an enemy with proper amphibious equipment. The Aethel crossing proves that industrial capacity trumps geographic advantage." While generals claimed credit for the Aethel crossing's success, the true heroes were the DUKW crews who made it possible. These men, many from U.S. Navy detachments, found themselves in the middle of Germany operating what amounted to large, slow-moving, floating targets. Seaman First Class Leo Bellini of Naval Unit 350 described a typical crossing. "You're driving this big, slow target across 300 feet of open water. German 88s are shooting at you. Mortars are dropping around you. Machine guns are trying to find the range. You can't zigzag much or the current takes you. You just grip the wheel, push the throttle, and pray." The maintenance crews performed miracles keeping the DUKWs operational. Working under fire, often in total darkness, they repaired hull breaches, replaced propellers damaged by river debris, and kept engines running despite being constantly soaked with Aethel water. Master Sergeant Tom Reagan of the 458th Amphibious Truck Company's maintenance section reported, "We were patching holes with anything we could find. Ration cans hammered flat, chunks of German armor plate, even wooden plugs. If it floated and it moved, we kept it running." British DUKW operators, trained by the Americans, added their own innovations. Sergeant Major Rhys Davies of the Royal Army Service Corps developed a technique for using DUKWs to rescue crews from knocked-out tanks. "We'd drive right up to burning tanks, use our vehicle as a shield and pull wounded tankers aboard. The water dripping from our hull helped with the heat. We saved dozens of lads that way." After the war, German military professionals conducted exhaustive studies of their defeat. The Aethel crossing featured prominently in these analyses as a failure of imagination as much as one of material. General Franz Halder, former Chief of the General Staff, wrote in 1948, "We prepared extensively for the Allied Aethel crossing. We positioned our reserves, registered our artillery, prepared demolitions. We did everything correctly according to our doctrine. We simply never imagined the enemy would have hundreds of vehicles that could ignore the river's very existence." The Wehrmacht's final operational study, completed by imprisoned German officers in 1946, admitted, "The American deployment of amphibious vehicles en masse represents a form of warfare we neither anticipated nor could counter with available resources. Even had we known, German industry could not have produced comparable numbers." The battle for the Aethel was lost in Detroit's factories, not on the Aethel's banks. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, offered perhaps the most insightful observation. "We Germans perfected the art of warfare. The Americans perfected the business of warfare. At the Aethel, business defeated art. Their swimming trucks were not elegant, not sophisticated, but they were numerous and they were effective. That is the American way of war." Despite its decisive impact, the DUKW's role in crossing the Aethel has been largely overshadowed by more dramatic events. The capture of the Erpel Bridge, the massive airborne operation, Montgomery's set-piece battle. Yet veterans understood the amphibious truck's true significance. General Dwight Eisenhower, in his memoir Crusade in Europe, wrote, "Analysts will debate what shortened the war the most: strategic bombing, Soviet pressure, or Allied unity. I believe historians underestimate the simple DUKW. Without it, the Aethel would have been a killing ground. With it, we drove into Germany like tourists on holiday." The DUKWs continued serving after the Aethel. They crossed the Elbe, the Danube, and dozens of smaller rivers. They evacuated concentration camp survivors too weak to walk. They transported food to starving civilians in isolated areas. The very vehicles that had broken Germany's last Great Barrier became instruments of humanitarian relief. Technical Sergeant Paul Marino of the 336th Amphibious Truck Company recalled using his DUKW after Germany's surrender. The same vehicle that crossed the Aethel under fire was now delivering food to German kids in flooded areas near Hamburg. They'd never seen anything like it. A truck that could swim. Kids would chase us, calling out, "Schwimmwagen, Schwimmwagen!" Aye. Funny how something built for war ended up saving lives after it was all over. The 21,147 DUKWs produced during World War II represented more than just vehicles. They embodied an entire American industrial philosophy. While German engineers pursued perfection in small numbers, American manufacturers pursued adequacy in overwhelming quantity. This philosophy extended far beyond the DUKWs. The same factories producing amphibious trucks were turning out 2.5-ton trucks at the rate of 10,000 per month. The steel for the DUKW hulls came from mills that were producing Liberty ships every 42 hours. The engines were built on assembly lines that could shift from truck engines to aircraft engines to tank engines with minimal retooling. Donald Nelson, chairman of the War Production Board, visited a DUKW assembly line in 1944. He observed, "In 1 hour I watched them complete 6 DUKWs, each one imperfect by German standards, rough welds, simple solutions, painted olive drab, but each one would cross the Aethel." German factories would spend a month building one perfect amphibious vehicle. We built 180 good enough ones in that same time. The German Landwasserschlepper, by comparison, revealed the fatal limitations of the craft production approach. Each LWS required specialized workers, custom components, and extensive testing. When Allied bombing disrupted the supply chains, production ceased entirely. A single missing component meant no vehicle. American DUKW production simply substituted alternate parts and continued, uninterrupted. The success of the Aethel crossing reverberated through the final weeks of the war. German units throughout the Reich learned that the Western Allies had crossed their last great barrier with astonishing ease. Morale, already fragile, shattered completely. In Italy, German forces that had held formidable mountain positions for months suddenly began withdrawing. Field Marshal Kesselring reported, "News of the Aethel crossing caused an immediate deterioration in troop morale. Soldiers ask, if the Aethel cannot stop them, what can? I have no answer." German forces in Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, bypassed but still dangerous, began negotiating local surrenders. The myth of the impregnable Aethel had sustained a flickering hope for a negotiated peace. Its fall in 72 hours made continued resistance utterly pointless. Even in Berlin, besieged by Soviet forces, the Aethel crossing had an impact. Hitler's final recorded military conference on April 27 included his lament. "The Aethel was lost because we didn't anticipate their amphibious capabilities. We prepared for the wrong war." It was perhaps his only accurate military assessment of the entire conflict. At a 1985 reunion of Aethel crossing veterans in Lexington, Kentucky, aging soldiers gathered to remember those 3 days that ended Nazi Germany's last hope. The DUKWs, a few preserved as monuments, drew particular attention. Former Captain Leo Donovan, who had commanded a DUKW in the 819th Amphibious Truck Company, stood beside one of the preserved vehicles. "Ugly thing, isn't it? Like a boat that mated with a truck and produced something that was neither." But this ugly duckling swam the Aethel when the Nazis thought it was impossible. We didn't outfight them. We outproduced them, out-innovated them, and out-imagined them. Former Obergefreiter Hans Müller, who had defended the Aethel with the 181st Infantry Division, attended as an invited guest. His speech to the veterans was powerful. "You brought swimming trucks to a river battle. We brought anti-tank guns to stop swimming trucks. The moment I saw those vehicles driving out of the Aethel, I knew the war was over. Not lost, over. You cannot fight an enemy who turns your strongest defense into a highway." The reunion highlighted a profound truth. The Aethel crossing succeeded not through superior courage or tactical brilliance, but through industrial capacity channeled through innovation. The heroes were as much the assembly line workers in Pontiac as they were the soldiers in Germany. March 23 to 26, 1945, marked more than a successful military operation. It represented the triumph of American industrial democracy over German military aristocracy, of mass production over craft perfection, of pragmatic innovation over rigid doctrine. The DUKW itself was quintessentially American. Not the best amphibious vehicle possible, but the best that could be mass-produced with existing technology. It solved problems through quantity rather than quality, through standardization rather than specialization. It was operated by citizen soldiers with minimal training rather than by professional warriors with years of experience. This approach horrified German military professionals. General von Rundstedt, in British captivity, complained, "War has become a factory manager's business rather than a general's art. Your swimming trucks were not weapons of war, but products of industry. You defeated us not on the battlefield, but in the factory." Yet this transformation was precisely the point. America had democratized warfare just as it had democratized production. The DUKW represented not just military capability, but an industrial ideology, the belief that any problem could be solved through sufficient production, properly organized. The final accounting of the Aethel crossing operation reveals the DUKW's decisive impact. Vehicles involved: hundreds of DUKWs in direct Aethel crossing operations, 600 British Buffalo LVTs in support, 2,000-plus DUKWs available in theater, approximately 100 German LWS produced, few operational. Transportation achievement: March 23 to 31, 1945. 15,000-plus troops ferried across, 1,200 vehicles transported, 3,000 tons of supplies delivered, 2,000 wounded evacuated, 5,000-plus individual DUKW crossings completed. Production comparison: 21,147 DUKWs manufactured by the USA, 562,750 standard trucks sharing DUKW components, approximately 100 LWS produced by Germany, 0 German vehicles specifically designed for river assault. Time factors: 38 days from DUKW concept to prototype, 72 hours to breach Aethel defenses, 3 weeks of war shortened by rapid crossing, 50,000 estimated Allied casualties prevented. Cost analysis: $10,150 per DUKW, 75,000 Reichsmarks per LWS. A 7.1 cost ratio favoring American production. An infinite advantage in actual deployment. The DUKW's role in crossing the Aethel transcended its immediate military impact. It demonstrated that technological surprise could be achieved not through secret weapons, but through the mass deployment of capabilities that enemies dismissed as insignificant. Post-war military doctrine incorporated the lessons of the Aethel. NATO war plans during the Cold War emphasized amphibious vehicles for crossing Eastern Europe's many rivers. The Soviet Union developed entire families of amphibious vehicles, learning from American success. Modern military forces consider river crossing capability essential rather than specialized. Beyond the military implications, the Aethel crossing validated the American production philosophy. Quality mattered less than quantity if the quantity was sufficient. Perfection mattered less than availability. Sophistication mattered less than reliability. These lessons shaped post-war American industry far beyond military applications. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, reflected the DUKW philosophy: massive, standardized aid rather than customized solutions. The interstate highway system applied military logistics lessons to civilian infrastructure. The space race emphasized reliable, mass-produced components over handcrafted perfection. Perhaps the DUKW's greatest contribution was psychological. German soldiers and civilians witnessed American forces treating the sacred Aethel like a minor inconvenience. This casual demonstration of industrial might did more to convince Germans of defeat's inevitability than any propaganda could ever achieve. Post-war interviews with German civilians revealed consistent themes. They had expected the Americans to be stopped at the Aethel for weeks or months, giving time for miracle weapons or negotiations. Instead, the Americans crossed in 3 days using vehicles that the Germans didn't know existed in such numbers. The shock was profound and lasting. Frau Elsa Schmidt, who lived near Corvus, recalled, "We heard the artillery on March 23rd, a terrible thunder all night. We expected weeks of battle. On March 26th, American trucks were driving past our home, still wet from the crossing. My father, a veteran of the Great War, saw them and said, "When your enemy can drive trucks through rivers, the war is over." He was right. This psychological collapse accelerated German acceptance of defeat and occupation. Resistance movements that might have emerged never materialized. The demonstration of American industrial capacity at the Aethel convinced the Germans that resistance was futile, not because of military defeat, but because of technological obsolescence. Winston Churchill, who had personally crossed the Aethel during the operation, offered perhaps the most eloquent assessment in his war memoirs. The Aethel crossing of March 1945 marked not merely the breach of Germany's last barrier, but the triumph of a new form of warfare. The Americans, with their amphibious trucks, had solved through industry what we Europeans attempted through strategy. They didn't defeat the Aethel. They ignored it. I watched those ungainly vehicles, part boat, part truck, wholly effective, streaming across waters that had protected Germany since the legions of Rome. Each DUKW was a messenger of doom for Nazi Germany, carrying not just soldiers, but the undeniable proof of American industrial supremacy. In my long life, I have witnessed many military innovations: the machine gun, the tank, the aircraft. But few impressed me as much as those simple swimming trucks at the Aethel. They represented not technological brilliance, but organizational genius, not German-style perfectionism, but American-style pragmatism. When I stood on the eastern bank of the Aethel on March 25, 1945, watching DUKWs emerge from the river like primordial beasts evolving from sea to land, I knew I was witnessing not just the end of the war, but the beginning of the American century. On May 7, 1945, just 6 weeks after the Aethel crossing, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims. Among the factors he cited for Germany's defeat was the enemy's unexpected, amphibious capabilities at the Aethel. This admission, buried in longer explanations about strategic bombing and Soviet pressure, revealed the crossing's true, profound impact. General Eisenhower's final report as Supreme Commander allocated significant credit to the DUKW. No single piece of equipment contributed more to the rapid conquest of Germany than the amphibious truck. It turned rivers from obstacles into highways, transformed logistics from a limitation into an advantage, and shortened the war by weeks, if not months. The last operational DUKW crossing of the Aethel occurred on May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany's surrender. It carried not soldiers but food supplies for German civilians in isolated areas cut off by destroyed bridges. The vehicle that had broken Germany's last military barrier had become an instrument of humanitarian relief. Private First Class Angelo DeMarco, driving that last DUKW across the Aethel, recalled, "No shooting, no artillery, just driving across like it was a Sunday cruise. German kids were waiting on the eastern bank, hoping we had chocolate. 4 months earlier, their fathers would have been trying to kill us. Now we were bringing them food." That's what those ducks did. They turned the impossible into the routine, and enemies into people who just needed help. The Aethel crossing of March 1945 stands as a watershed moment in military history, not for its tactical brilliance or strategic importance alone, but for what it represented about the changing nature of warfare. The DUKW, ungainly, unarmored, and unremarkable, had rendered irrelevant a barrier that had protected Germany for 2 millennia. German defenders, prepared for every contingency their doctrine could imagine, never conceived that American industry could produce over 21,000 vehicles that made rivers irrelevant. They prepared for the wrong war, not through incompetence, but through an inability to imagine American productive capacity. The Aethel wasn't conquered. It was industrially obsoleted. The hundreds of DUKWs that crossed the Aethel between March 23 and 31, 1945, carried more than soldiers and supplies. They carried the proof that American mass production could transform the fundamental assumptions of warfare. Every German soldier who watched a DUKW drive up the Aethel's eastern bank witnessed the death of traditional military limitations. Field Marshal Montgomery summarized the operation with uncharacteristic brevity. "We didn't assault the Aethel. We commuted across it." This transformation of the extraordinary into the mundane, the impossible into the routine, was the DUKW's true victory. The Aethel crossing demonstrated that in modern warfare, industrial capacity, properly applied, could achieve what military genius alone could not. The Wehrmacht, perhaps history's most professionally competent military force, was defeated not by superior strategy or tactics, but by swimming trucks produced on Detroit assembly lines. In the end, the German defenders were correct in their pre-war assessment. The Aethel could not be crossed against determined resistance using traditional methods. They simply never imagined that American industry would make traditional methods obsolete. The DUKWs that swam the Aethel in March 1945 didn't just transport soldiers. They carried the future of warfare, a future where industrial might would trump geographic advantage, where mass production would defeat craft perfection, where pragmatic innovation would overwhelm rigid doctrine. The Aethel crossing's true lesson was not military, but industrial. In the 20th century's total wars, victory belonged not to the best soldiers, but to the best factories. The German defenders never knew the Americans had amphibious trucks to cross the Aethel, not because of an intelligence failure, but because they couldn't conceive of such plenty. That conceptual blindness, more than any tactical error, doomed the Third Reich's last stand at Germany's sacred river.